Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Jasper, and I'm a program specialist for the Law School Engagement and Advocacy Unit here at Equal Justice Works. Today, we're here for another installment of the My Impact Alumni Series, this time with Annie Lee, a 2014 Equal Justice Works Fellow. We're here today to talk about how an Equal Justice Works Fellowship launched Annie's career and to hopefully inspire law students to follow their passion for public service and equal justice. Thank you, Annie, for taking the time to speak with me today.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Great. Let's start from the very beginning. Did you always want to be a lawyer? What compelled you to pursue a career in public service?
That's a great question. I always wanted to work in public service, but I didn't always want to be a lawyer. So I started my career as a public school teacher in the Bronx, New York. I taught 11th grade US history. I loved it. Had the most amazing time in the classroom with my students, whom I loved. Had an amazing co-teacher, and we really created this amazing multicultural curriculum so that our students could see themselves reflected in US history and feel empowered to write the next chapter in US history. And they excelled in all of the metrics. But what I realized in my time teaching is that they faced so many barriers outside of our classroom and our school. I was really interested in trying to address some of those. And so that's why I went to law school. And then during law school, I happened to find a really wonderful community through a clinic called the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau. And that's when I really learned about Equal Justice Works and the path to pursuing a public interest legal career.
Great. And so you talked a little bit about how you came to hear about Equal Justice Works. But when you were learning about Equal Justice Works and came across the Design Your Own Fellowship program, what motivated you to apply for it?
Well, I knew I wanted to pursue public interest, so I knew I had to get a fellowship. And luckily, I had a great cohort of other public interest students at my school, and there was a lot of support from my school. And so that's why I knew about Equal Justice Works and I knew about the process. And so I think that that's so critical because I come from a family that nobody else is a lawyer, and my parents really couldn't help me navigate through the system. My parents are also monolingual Chinese speakers. And so it's a whole new world for me trying to navigate by myself. And so I do recommend to law school students, especially if you're first generation, like really reach out to people in your community, like students, but also faculty and administrators, because you don't have to navigate it alone. So luckily I heard about Equal Justice Works. I spoke to public interest advising at my school, and they really laid out the process and broke it down for me, because otherwise it can be overwhelming and confusing, but I was very lucky to have that support. And so I knew I wanted to pursue that route. And I also knew that I wanted to work in public interest, specifically with students, specifically back in the Bay Area where I'm from. And so having that clarity, I think, is really helpful in just figuring out your path after law school.
Definitely, yeah. It's really great to have that community of people who are helping you as you're navigating what you want to do with your career, and just even being able to ask them questions and get advice from people is really important. As you were going through this process and leaning on these individuals who were providing you that guidance, how did you figure out your host organization? How did you find them, and how did you start collaborating with them to build out the Design Your Own Fellowship project that you worked on?
I think this is a good lesson in always maintaining good relationships with folks. So I'm from San Francisco, and I knew I wanted to return to the Bay Area for my summer internships and eventually for my fellowships. And so when I interviewed for my summer internship after 1L, I interviewed at a bunch of organizations, including what eventually became my host organization, the National Center for Youth Law. But for that summer internship after 1L, I actually turned down Nickel and chose another internship. But during that summer, I still maintained a great relationship with the then executive director at the National Center for Youth Law. And even though I wasn't working at his organization, we still got coffee, we still met up, and we still talked. And I loved where I worked my 1L summer, but those internships really help you figure out, is this the place that I want to work after? And so I just knew that wasn't the right fit for me. And so come 2L summer, when I'm applying for a fellowship in a host organization, I went back to Nickel and I was like, hi, I know I turned you down last summer, but I'm still really interested. And it's so important to maintain good relationships with folks. And so luckily this time when they offered me the host organization sponsorship, I was like, yes, I would love that. And so then we worked together to develop a project. And I think this is one other piece of advice I have for law students. It's not just on you to figure out this new idea. You can work with other people to do this. And in fact, for me, it was really helpful because I'd spent, even though I'm from California, I'd spent so much of my adult life outside of California and on the East Coast. And so, I did not know that there was this new local control funding formula law in California that was just being implemented and rolling out. And so talking to my host organization about my passions, which were education, hearing their understanding of the current landscape in California, that's how we came together to make this project idea. And I think that that's really helpful too. It's not entirely on you. You don't have to generate a brand new idea that nobody else has ever thought of. It doesn't have to be like that. You should take that pressure off yourself.
Definitely. Yeah, and that is really such an important thing, is being able to talk to the host organization you want to work with. Having that conversation, you don't have to come up with something brand new that's never been done before. You're right, you are there to help with work with your host organization and identify needs within the communities they serve to make sure that your project is helping serve them. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. For law students who are listening and are trying to figure out what area of public interest law they want to get involved in. I know you talked about how you had previous experience in education, but if they're trying to figure out what area they want to get involved in, or even what they want to design their fellowship project around, do you have any advice for them?
Yes, I highly recommend doing a clinic in law school. It is the best learning experience, far better than any doctrinal class you can have. And it exposes you to law in two ways. So one is content area. So do you want to work in criminal justice reform or education or child welfare, immigration? And that's really important. But I actually would say content is less important than the type of work you want to do. And so clinics are also very helpful because they will give you an opportunity to do direct legal services and figure out, are you that type of lawyer that you like to work directly with people? Or you can try a clinic that is more appellate work, where you're not actually interacting with clients, nor are you arguing in court. Really, you're doing a lot of research and writing. And maybe that's the skill set that you really enjoy. And I would argue that that is far more important. Like the way you do your work is far more important than what type of work you do, what field you're in, because that's the day to day. Like, are you always wanting to be in court? Are you never wanting to be in court? Do you like to work with people, or do you like to work solo? Do you like to engage in oral advocacy, or do you like to write and research? Like, those are the areas that you really need to figure out what you enjoy doing, because that's where you spend your time. I mean, that's what work is. And so you just have to figure out what type of person are you? And so I think clinics are a really good opportunity to do that. And then also your summer internships. Figure out a place that you think matches both in terms of the content and the skill sets that you enjoy. And then the last thing I would say is the summer internships are really helpful in pinning down geographically where you want to be. People move around all the time, but I will say because every state has its own bar exam, it is kind of a pain to move sometimes. So if you know where you want to be, it's nice to set roots down and really get to know that community, because the legal community, especially in public interest, especially if you know what fields you want to be in. So for instance, education, it's really small and people know each other and people really help each other out. And so the sooner you can insert yourself into that network, the better it will be for you.
Right, that's a great way of thinking about it. Really, what do you want your day-to-day to be? Because that is going to be your job. That is going to be what you're doing on the day-to-day. So what kind of work do you want to get involved in? That's a great advice. Thank you for sharing that. Now let's pivot to talking about your Equal Justice Works Fellowship. During your fellowship, what issues were you specifically working to address? I know you mentioned it a little bit before when you were talking about collaborating with your host organization. If you could just talk a little bit more about what issues you're working to address. And then also throughout your fellowship, did you collaborate with community partners or stakeholders? And if so, what did that collaboration look like?
Yeah. So my fellowship had so many different facets, but one of the main ones is implementing in California. There was a new local control funding formula law, which is money to school districts. And for the first time, the law held school districts accountable for the outcomes of foster youth students. I mean, you're talking about a population that is generally invisible in our schools, even though they're very vulnerable, but people view foster youth as like a child welfare issue and not the other aspects of this child's life, including this child's schooling. So really highlighting this vulnerable population for the first time and having school districts service these students. So that required a lot of education to school districts who typically did not think about foster youth students in a way that was very primary in their conscientiousness. And so worked a lot with OUSD, that's Oakland Unified School District, as well as San Francisco Unified School District. I developed basically a template. So part of local control funding formula was increasing transparency about how these funds are used by school districts. And they have this whole plan called the Local Control Accountability Plan. And so I made a model template for all the school districts in California about what are the services that are best for kids in foster care in terms of engaging students and student voice, engaging caretakers, and all of that. And so that was a whole aspect of my work. But I also got to work on other students' education issues. So I directly represented students who were in special education and school discipline matters. I also worked on class actions related to education. So making sure that expelled students still have the right to access a high quality education, making sure that in a particular school district, they were not disproportionately disciplining Black students and students with disabilities. And so that was really helpful for me because, again, it gave me the breadth of the type of legal work that's possible, from direct services to working with community members in school districts and advocacy at the state level in terms of what these regulations looked like, to class action litigation typically with a lot of partners. Many nonprofits work with big law firms to bring about these cases. And so it really gave me a range of experiences that I thought was really helpful in terms of me figuring out what do I like, what do I want to continue, what maybe isn't the best fit for me.
Great, thank you. During your fellowship, what would you say was the biggest challenge that you faced? And how did you work to either work through it or overcome it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sarah. I will say, I think for young attorneys, one of the most important things to receive is feedback. And I think different organizations do it differently and different people receive feedback differently. And it's hard because you're no longer in school. You're not even, in a clinic environment where you kind of get continuous feedback. And so it's different as a working professional. And so I was really craving feedback, like, am I doing things right? Where can I improve? And I will say one thing that really helped me figure out, was I on track, was the Equal Justice Works Fellowship requires you to make these 6-month reports. And while that is very cumbersome, it is actually really helpful in reflecting on what did I accomplish in the last 6 months, and am I on track? Where do I need to change and pivot? And that has helped me throughout my career, especially if you're in a job that doesn't have very clear benchmarks. Litigation can go on for a really long time. How do you know if you're doing something right? And so it's just helpful to build in metrics periodically to check in and make sure that you are actually on the right track, because time will fly by. And if you don't write it down and if you're not methodical about reflecting on it, you will wonder, what did I accomplish in this last year? And so those Equal Justice Works reports were cumbersome, but very, very helpful.
Right. That is something too, right? Where if you're not keeping track of what you've been doing, you're like, oh, I'll remember it later on. And you come back and go, no, what? Oh, I don't remember anything what happened, because you're really right. You're just moving forward and you're focusing on what's happening and what's coming down the road. That was really great advice. Thank you. During your fellowship, you finished, you're working on this project. You have working with a lot of different partners, as you mentioned. There's a lot of different aspects of the Design Your Own Fellowship projects. What did you do during that to help maintain a work-life balance? That way work wasn't everything that you were doing.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I think it's a really important question, and something that I think we want to put at the forefront of young public interest attorneys like minds. Because it is very easy to just let that go by the wayside, because the needs of your clients and the urgency of the situation is so important that you want to give everything you have. But I think it is really important that we're talking about the long game, and we're talking about like being in public interest for your entire career. And so you don't want to burn out and flame out very early, but you want to create a sustainable career, and that does require taking care of yourself and setting appropriate boundaries. It's helpful. What was helpful for me is I am from the Bay Area, and so my family is here. A lot of friends are here, and so that kind of like forced me to spend time with people, because there was no more excuse. I wasn't across the country anymore. And so that helped. And I do think it's really important. And I think this is something that law students should look at in host organizations as well, like sustainability. And it's really hard to figure out culture from the outside. You kind of don't know until you're in it. But if there are any opportunities to talk to staff about what's the culture in the place? Like, do people really stop checking email after the business day ends? Or is this a place where everybody's on email all the time? What about weekend work? How common is that? If you feel like it's appropriate for you to ask someone that you trust in the organization those hard questions, I think that you should definitely do that, because it does really matter. And I can be personal here. I mean, I think it really matters for folks who, like, if you want to start a family, like, how do you balance like this very intense career with like the other passions in your life and other priorities? And so I think these work life and culture questions are really important.
You're completely right. Right. It is important to have that balance between it, because you do want to give everything to your clients and the people you're working with. But if you're burning yourself out, then you can't really be your best self when you're there helping them. So thank you for sharing how you help maintain a work-life balance, because it is something that really is on everyone's minds. Now let's transition and talk about your post-fellowship path. How did you make the transition out of your fellowship to a full-time job in public interest law? What was that like?
I had a wonderful mentor and supervisor at the National Center for Youth Law. And so as my fellowship was ending, I felt safe to talk to her about next steps. And I really encourage fellows to do that. Like, again, it can feel weird, because if you're looking for something outside of your host organization, how do you talk about that? But if you have a good relationship with your supervisor or someone else in the organization, I think it is an important conversation to have, rather than trying to, again, navigate it on your own. You really don't have to. And I found that people want to support you, and people want to support other, public interest lawyers, and people also understands that, you don't have to stay in one organization for the rest of your life, but like, it's actually good to have relationships with people in all different organizations and governments and things like that. And that's actually just how the world works, building those relationships with folks. And so as I was approaching in the middle of my second year, I spoke to my supervisor, and we talked about different options. And the Office for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education has a San Francisco office, and they don't hire all that often, but they happen to be hiring. And so we talked about it, and I put in my application, and actually heard back very quickly, which I was surprised by, because oftentimes I thought that government would work really slowly, but it was very, very quick. And then interviews, got the job, and I really felt like my Equal Justice Works fellowship set me up for success at the Department of Education as a civil rights attorney, because I had so much direct experience representing students and working with students in schools. I mean, I was reading IEPs, individualized education plans, all the time for the clients that I was representing. And now I was doing the same thing at the US Department of Education in cases that I was investigating. And so like all of the lingo, all of the acronyms, I mean, I was already very steeped in education law. And so that transition was really easy for me and very natural. And so I thought that that went really well. One little, it wasn't a hiccup, but like a need to change my mindset is, you know, I came from being an advocate for always representing my students and their best interests, and oftentimes fighting against school districts, to now being at OCR, you are a neutral investigator, and you're neutral, you're not on the side of the students or the schools. And having to make that shift was a little hard for me because I come from an advocacy background. And so I had to make that pivot. It was also interesting, you know, coming as an advocate from a nonprofit, like in terms of power dynamics, it was like me and my students, little Davids versus like the Goliath of the school district coming down on us. And then when I went to the US Department of Education in the Office for Civil Rights, I had the full force. I was the government. I am the federal government telling these schools to give me all of this data and all of these IEPs and all of their suspension data, and they have to do it. I mean, it was kind of incredible. And it's a power that you have to use wisely, obviously, but that was also something of an adjustment. I mean, I went from being like, please give me this IEP to now like, here's the deadline and I need it then. And so that was interesting. But that was, yeah. And so anyway, I credit my Equal Justice Works Fellowship for setting me up really well for that transition.
Oh, great, thank you. What advice do you have for people who may be unsure about what comes next after their fellowship?
You know, I have a couple pieces of advice. The first is just an understanding that life is not linear. And so I think there's so much emphasis on what do I do next? How will it set me up for XYZ? And like this idea that it's just a straight path. And while it may have been like that from like elementary school to middle school to high school to college to law school, like after that, it's wide open. And I think that can cause a lot of fear and anxiety. Like, but how do I know what's the right next step? And just reminding yourself that there is no right next step. It is whatever step you choose. And that choosing one thing for the immediate future does not necessarily foreclose other things. And I think that at least has really helped me, because just knowing that life is more circular and you can go around and back, and it's not like the straight path that once you start you can never stop. That put a lot of pressure on me, and taking that away, I think, really helped me understand that life has chapters and you can go back and forth and winds back around. And so just take a deep breath, and the next step is going to be fine, whatever you choose. And then the other piece of advice, which I know sounds really trite, but you have to network. Like you have to just have relationships. And all of my jobs have come not from my direct, like closest friends, but actually like my secondary network, people that I know who know me, and sometimes we see each other. And you know, it'll just be like, oh, I saw this job opening, like thought you would be a good fit for this. I think that is so important, and just maintaining relationships with folks, and just you know, asking folks how they're doing, what they're currently working on, because that is, you want to maintain good relationships with people, because they will help you advance your career in ways that you cannot even foresee right now. And similarly, you will be doing that for other people. Like I think it's very important to like pay it forward, not only for like younger people and the next generation, but like your peers, and everybody helps each other out. And so like I think that's just really important to remember as you move forward.
So true. And that actually really leads to my next question, because on top of having been a 2014 Equal Justice Works Designer and Fellow, you're also the chair of our Alumni Advisory Committee, our council, excuse me, and helping really connect Equal Justice Works Fellows and alums together to continue to build up that Equal Justice Works community. So my question is, how have you leveraged the Equal Justice Works community before you're part of the Alumni Advisory Council, and even now as the chair of the Alumni Advisory Council, to help you in your career and make connections with other people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the best parts of being on the Alumni Advisory Council is the diversity in the AAC. And so we've got folks from all across the country, but also like different fields, but also like different types of fellowships and different parts of their career. I mean, some folks are just starting out, some folks have been working for decades now. And I think that has been really important. And so I can give a very concrete example that Jeremy Rosen, who's on our AAC, has been practicing for a long time. And one of his roles has been director of policy before. And I was going out for this new job that was a director of policy role. And so I was just able to get a one-on-one with him and ask him, so, tell me about what directors of policy do, like what would make a good director of policy? What should I emphasize in my interview? I mean, there was a very direct opportunity to receive help from a fellow AAC member. But beyond that, it's been really amazing to hear what people are doing. And what I've really loved is when we get together and provide information and services for others, including alumni, fellows, prospective law school students. And so a bunch of us served on a panel for government lawyering. And so that was really interesting because we ran the gamut. I have federal government experience. There are DAs for states, there are local DAs. And so that was just really amazing to share our breadth of experience with different members of the Equal Justice Works community. And we also had another panel on academia. We have a couple of folks in the AAC who work in academia. And so that's another interesting path, but a path that I think can be a little obscure for folks. And they don't know, how do you get into this field, for instance? And so breaking down that process for folks was really nice. And then we have another panel in the summer about mental health and working with clients who may have mental health challenges and what are some best practices there. And so I really like when we come together and leverage our skills and experiences to give back to the Equal Justice Works community.
Yeah, the work on the council has done is just really fantastic. I always appreciate getting to hear about the different panels that you're putting together and different opportunities to really build that community. Because as you mentioned earlier, the public interest legal community, it's small, people know each other. And so really getting to connect people that way and help them see how they can build their career, how they can use their skills for certain things is just really important. My last question for you today is, what's one piece of advice you'd give to anyone interested in following in your footsteps? You've been giving fantastic advice throughout, but just as a final send off, what's something and a piece of advice you'd give to someone who wants to, do what you've been doing?
My last piece of advice is to leverage your law school experience. So clinics, externships, summer internships to try to figure out the content area that you like to work in, the skills you'd like to build, and the geographical region that you want to be in. And there's no time to do that. The best time to do that is in law school, where you actually have these opportunities to try new things and experiment and figure different things out. And so, yeah, if you want to jump from one clinic to another clinic, you should absolutely do that and try to figure out what you like. And as you go through this journey, just remember to remember folks' names and what they do and keep in touch. And you'd be surprised how people remember you and will want to help you in the future, and likewise how you will want to help them, because we're really all in this together.
Very true. Thank you so much for that. I want to thank you, Annie, for taking the time to speak with me today. It was such a pleasure to learn about what motivated you to become an Equal Justice Works Fellowship, to learn more about what you were doing in your fellowship, your career journey following it, and the work you've been doing on the Alumni Advisory Council. And most importantly, on behalf of Equal Justice Works, we just want to thank you again for your continued commitment to advocating on behalf of underserved communities. It's really just great having you as part of the Equal Justice Works community. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, we hope everyone enjoyed this installment of the My Impact series. I know I did, and we hope you will continue to follow the series going forward throughout the rest of the summer. Thank you, everyone, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.